going well over here.
You see that all right? Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, it's yes, it's lovely here. What a nice day outside. So it's going to be a good weekend, I think.
So
I feel for people in the other hemisphere where it's winter.
Yeah.
Especially that picture you sent for me, Jesse.
Oh, that was a joke. That was the blizzard in '97. We don't have quite that much snow yet.
Yeah, I came back from Vancouver on Monday, and that I sent Jesse a picture on Tuesday as I was driving into the campus, and I thought there was absolutely no difference. It was overcast, rain here, just like it was in Vancouver, except we had thunder and lightning. So
Yeah.
and Canada didn't have that.
So before we get started really quick, does anybody have, if you've looked at the SINC website, does anybody have any suggestions for content or aesthetics or anything like that?
I think I've got it open here somewhere. This should be opening just a sec. It didn't open perfectly for me, although, wait a minute.
Tim had said that it had a few issues too, so.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's only in for me, it's just in the design of the members. The name members is a little bit higher in the Mandelbrot picture there. Otherwise, it looks
okay. Yeah, there's some scaling issues with that web editor. I might switch it over to a different type of web editor where it doesn't scale quite right for every type. I mean, it looks really good on mine, but as soon as anybody else brings it up on their web browser, it'll go ahead and scale differently. So I need to look into doing that a little bit better.
Yeah, but apart from that, I think it's a great start. Gee.
Yeah, that's all I wanted was a little bit of a start on it. Wonder where Tim is. Tim was supposed to be here today. I'm going to send him an invite real quick just to remind him.
What's Mike up to? Is he?
Mike and Nicola both had something this evening to do, so they apologize for not being here, but they said they would watch us on the recording.
Okay.
So Tim will probably be along here in a little bit, but do you want to go ahead and get started, Alan?
Yep, sure.
Okay.
I'm assuming that everyone can see the slideshow, okay? Get a nod, yes? Okay. All right, well, this presentation, as I said in the abstract, was kind of sparked from the fact that for 2 or 3 years now, the SINC group's been together, and we often have these wonderful discussions and presentations, and underlying it has always been this question of what is it that we're talking about? When we talk about complexity, do we all mean the same thing? And so this is my attempt to try and make a little bit of sense of that and to think about what does it mean to work in this field. In some ways, I sort of oscillate backwards and forwards, and you'll see that in this presentation where I'm thinking, my colleagues, because I work in a very critically oriented program, and many of my colleagues look at complexity as too scientific and doesn't have a place in the work that we do. But at the same time, when I hear them talk about issues, or I look at life and teaching and what have you, I think to myself, no. The starting point is that teaching is highly complex, and many of the ideas that and ways I'm thinking are highly applicable to the teaching field and health and physical education and sport. So that's where it's kind of come to. And so this is what I'm trying to work out in my own mind. So let me see if I can make that live. There we go. So this is where we're at. If you look in the literature, you'll see ideas around complexity theory. There are ideas that you see, some people call it a complexity science, and there's the complexity sciences, which tend to overlap with the learning sciences. You've got an idea called complexity thinking, and people attach themselves to this concept of complexity thinking. And then the thing that I like to explore a little bit more is this idea of theories of complexity. Is there one complexity theory, or are there multiple? Are there complexity theories? Are there multiple theories that try and explain complexity? And I suppose at the very start here, I'd like to say that the answer to the question is yes. Yes, they all exist, and they all can exist, and that is very much a product of the paradigm or the system of thinking in which we've been working. We're probably really struggling for an overarching title, and as you'll see, I think that's very much a product of the nature of the field. I want to start by saying that we are very much the product of the era in which we are born. And that implies sort of, this is the way I picture myself. My background at university was coming in, initially being trained in the sciences and through physical education and sports science, and then moving towards more of an educational base and getting interested in philosophy, and I kind of sit on that bank and I look at the new things that are emerging, and across that divide is these new ideas that are starting to emerge. And I'd like to say that we're a product of the era in which we're born, because the hardest transition to make is trying to use the ideas of complexity when we are so well grounded in non-complexity ideas. The ontologies, the conceptual frameworks and everything are very much grounded in a traditional base. So making that transition is perhaps the hardest thing, and that could be something that we talk a little bit about today. And when so the three things that I'm sort of implying there is that there's an ontological aspect to complexity and an ontological shift. So the systems of thought that we are embedded in are shifting and changing, and have been shifting and changing for the last 2,000 years. And we are very much a product of this late modern era, or if you're in my age group, this late modern era of thinking, and now we're moving into a new way of thinking. So that's the ontological shift that's taking place. There's also a conceptual shift, and the conceptual shift is important because of the types of conceptual tools and the types of languages that we have access to, and the way that old language and old concepts are being problematized by this new field. And I'll come back to that. But issues of, tools like voice, interview, and narrative and things like that are highly problematized under this shift towards more complexity style of thinking. And the last one's the notion of reflexivity. When reflexivity is this, the ability to operate and think and work within this new field. Once again, I'm very much the product of an old sort of form of reflexivity or subjectivity, and moving to that new form is very difficult. Okay, so I'll move on from that. That's kind of the framing, and I'll pick up those three themes all the way through, and you'll be able to see all the messages that keep on popping up all the way through. Can you see those messages? Are they popping up on your screen? Yeah, all right, sorry about that. Okay, so I think the way to start here is, what is the story that's most often told about complexity? And it doesn't take long to find some sort of diagram like this, which gives you the genealogy of complexity, the field of complexity. And it's interesting, some people take that back 15 years or 20 years, or maybe at the beginning and turn of the century. But if you look at this, you'll see that there's a number of different key ideas, key theories that have emerged in the field as ways of solving specific problems that the researchers at the time were looking at. So we have in the early 1930s and what have you, systems theory, cybernetics, and moving on from that. And within that field, there are a number of key people, like Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who was the originator of general systems theory. And general systems theory is interesting because of the concepts that it brings and have been picked up and moved ahead into other ideas. Wiener's ideas around cybernetic theory, another one, and you can see that these are moving forward. Lorenz's work in dynamical systems is really important. Stuart Kaufman's work in biology, picking up some of these ideas and being able to put them into biological systems, and you'll see some of the concepts that are coming through. And then later on, much later on, what we call sort of like the second generation, third generation type complexity people are picking up these ideas and reforming them into educational type ideas. This map also doesn't pick up sort of the big shifts in sciences like Charles Darwin's ideas. And once again, there's another set of concepts that are introduced through Darwin. All the quantum mechanics work from Max Planck and his work, and how that feeds in Van Neumann's work and around game theory. So there is a quite a sort of a biography, a genealogy of ideas, the way they have been developed, solving specific problems in specific fields, but also as those concepts are being refined, feeding into new areas and people being able to pick them up and redefine them. And so in one sense, you could say that complexity theory, as it's most often thought of, is that ability to study complex systems using the concepts and tools from multiple systems theory, or multiple systems theories. So in one sense, if there is a thing that we call complexity theory, then really it's kind of a mishmash, a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of different theories and different concepts that have been brought together in order to understand complex systems. Now, that has been picked up by a number of different theorists on the philosophy and education fields, someone like Paul Cilliers, for instance, who can see that human social systems are very similar. They're complex and they're non-linear, and has been able to identify the types of characteristics that we've used and discussed in the SINC group. And I won't go through all of those, but they're very much the concepts that we're used to. Perhaps importantly, there have been a number of people, as they see how broad this field is, have tried to reconceptualize what this field is. Once again, Cilliers along with Richardson, brings in, divides the field into the hard complexity sciences, the soft complexity sciences, and complexity thinking. And certainly Tim and I and Mike and what have you have drawn, I suppose, heavily from the complexity thinking areas of how this is going to inform our work. At the same time, there's a story that's less often told, a different genealogy. In fact, there are multiple stories that are less often told, and I don't want this to be a binary. One of those stories would be, I suppose, the story of philosophy and where those various philosophers and systems of thinking have evolved over time. And in a sense, this story that I'm looking at here is much more around the social sciences. And I suppose why I'm looking at this is because if we go back a couple of things here, you'll notice that this is developed in response to a series of problems in the sciences, the hard sciences, and have been picked up as ways of understanding the effect of human activity in a big scale, and tend not to look at the individual sort of interactions of humans. And so when I was looking at this, I was kind of thinking, well, if all the sciences, biology, physics, economics, and all of those sciences have picked up and responded to complexity, how has philosophy and sociology responded to complexity? And so this is the story that's less often told. And it's worth stating here that there's some interesting things about philosophy and the way we've thought about and conceptualized understanding humans. The development of humanism is a broad sort of system of thinking that places humans at the center of the world and recognizes rationality as really important to the way humans operate. Modernism, in a similar way, is a response to the sciences, that ability to use rational thought to develop technologies that improve our everyday lives, and that notion that we're constantly improving. And structuralism, which has evolved out of a way of trying to understand how we make meaning, especially in terms of language and texts, and understanding early structuralism. It was about understanding structures. All systems have structures, and so we can only understand and communicate with each other by the way words and sentences emerge from specific structures, like the English language or the Portuguese language or something like that. Now, these fields themselves have come under some stress. So we've seen things like postmodernism emerge as a critique of some of those modernist ideas. We've seen post-structuralism emerge as a critique of some of the structuralist ideas. Postmodernism being a reaction against some of the ideas that we're always improving, that we can apply science to everything, that we need to be more eclectic and looking at being able to combine different ideas. And the post-structuralist ideas of saying meaning is not always emergent from structures, and that it is very much more of a fluid type idea, with some people saying that language is the core, and all of our understandings of reality are constructed in and through language and the way language works. I would say in the last probably 10 years or so, we've started to see some more change. So we start to see some ideas around posthumanism. Posthumanism is a response against humanism, saying, well, humans don't always exist as the center of the world. They're just part of a broader system in which other elements like animals and things make up are as important and have the ability to influence and have a sense of agency within a system. And humanism doesn't take that into account. New materialism tends to be a response to the post-structural limitations and belief in language. So new materialism comes back and says, well, there's an existence outside language, and the two, discourse and what have you, can sit together. And all of these things are leading to a new sense of perhaps ontology, new ontologies, new philosophies that are dealing with new ways of thinking about the world. So when I look at that story, I think to myself, they're dealing with a shift. They're dealing with a series and sets of ideas that somehow are moving in a way which is parallel to what the sciences are doing with the way that they're thinking. And so as I said, it's a story less often told about the nature of complexity and complexity in human systems of thought. So when I look at those two, and the huge risk in doing this is to assume that there are some similarities both within the philosophical traditions and also in the science traditions and biography that are coming here, assuming that there is something the same. In fact, the paradigm shift that we're making is implying that there should be differences, not saying this. But anyway, within that, something, we're looking at some sort of ontological threads which seem to be similar. So that's what I'm looking at. These what are some of the ontological shifts that we need to be attending to and be thinking about? The first one is this notion of relationality. There is an aspect that the ontological awareness that we're not single entities, but we're entities in relation to being influenced by and influencing other entities around us. And it's the way that these entities come together and connect which are important. And so there's an implication here. All material, social, abstract entities are relational, having no ontological status or integrity other than that produced through their relationship to other similar contingent ephemeral bodies, things, and ideas. So it's a really strong and important point there. I suppose to step one thing back, and people have seen my little diagram here before, I really like this as a visual metaphor of how I think about relationality. In a sense, this implies the idea that we are highly connectable and animals or things, and that ideas and objects and people come into interaction with each other, and it's a constantly fluid type thing. Sometimes these interactions can create entities. Sometimes those interactions and nodes might last for a while, but then they can just also reform themselves and move on. The notion of relationality means that there's different ways of thinking about those collectivities. And so in these theories, you'll see things like system, assemblage, community, mangle, entanglement. They go on and on and on. They all imply the notion of relationality as an ontological key point. System is the key one for those who tend to study complexity. But there are other ways that of thinking about that collectivity that bring particular different ideas. A second idea is the notion of nonlinearity. And that nonlinearity and understanding what that implies. For me, the key thing here in terms of an ontological position is that the notion of quasi-cause, or being able to challenge the notion of cause and effect. And that so much of our contemporary thinking is trying to understand cause and effect. And that in a non-linear world, cause and effect becomes a lot more problematic. So that when ideas interact with each other, it's not always a simple binary of either it goes ahead or it doesn't, but they can be amplified, they can be squashed, they can be reshaped, they can, so the understanding of how ideas come into play with each other and what the outcome with that is quite difficult to understand. And so nonlinearity, understanding that sort of the non-certainty of how information impacts and influences other nodes in that collective is a really core ontological point. The third point here is the notion of affect. And by shifting to the notion of affect, we get away from the idea of subject and object and agency. In that, instead, what we're looking at is that everything is influenced and can influence other things. Affect. So we start to look at not so much what something is, or what or breaking it down to its core idea, but we begin to think more in terms of what can this do? What influence does this idea have? So, for instance, we take an idea like physical literacy. Instead of focusing on physical literacy as an object which has some sort of substance and it can be defined and what have you, we then begin to look at that idea through affect. So what political work is it doing? What ideological work is it doing? And I suppose that allows us to start conceptualizing this thing not as a thing, but more as a meme, which can have an existence independent of the people involved. Fourth idea is the idea of immanence. And that the idea of immanence is that it's a little bit like emergence, and that things are contained in and of themselves. They have a power to come into existence through the interactions and relationships of other elements. Immanence is a reaction to the idea of transcendence. So transcendent thought is that idea that we can develop knowledge which is transcendent across a number of different settings. Once again, it relates back to the notion of substance. There's a real thing there that has an existence beyond itself, and it can move as an object. Whereas immanence is the idea that things emerge in response to the constituent elements that are forming it. It doesn't necessarily have a transcendent or generalized nature. And that relates to the notion of becoming. Becoming entities are always in the process of emerging as a result of the way that parts interact with each other. The key idea here, ontologically, is that a focus on becoming means that we're moving away from understanding what something is, being, so a focus on an object and trying to understand the substance involved in that object, what something is, to more the notion of how does that thing come into existence, and then questioning what is it capable of doing, what type of influence or effect does it have on the surrounding elements. And so that's quite a significant one. If things don't have a substance but only an affect, that's quite a big shift. Another ontological thread related to that, then, if everything is immanent and in the process of becoming, that means that everything is different. Entities exist in and of themselves without grounding to any ideal model. Now, in the Western way of thinking, what is core is, I suppose, the Platonic idea, Plato's idea, that there is an ideal form. And that when we talk about something like a tree, what we think about is there is an ideal concept of a tree, And everything, every tree that we see differs from that in some way. There's never the ideal tree. And so that implies that research is always trying to, if we get enough trees, we can somehow begin to understand what that ideal tree might actually look like. And so we're always trying to, that's in a traditional way. But here, difference means something else. Difference means that there's no ideal. Everything is different, because if everything is imminent and in the process of becoming, then it can become something that's different from something else. There's no ideal form. It is just the sheer product of the forces that are in play in that particular time. So therefore, the entities that we're studying that exist in and of themselves and have an impact on the surroundings. And so therefore, it makes it very difficult to define some sort of generic theory or generic sort of transcendent ideas that's going to move to the next spot. This one, I suppose, is related to all of them. So much of our contemporary thinking is representational thought. We try and study and make our research is about trying to develop representations of the objects and the things that we're studying. And so representation is about trying to understand the world as it really is. And therefore it tends to invoke a spatial epistemology where our understanding or our focus is trying to look at that substance. What is the essence of this thing? What is it? And how can I represent it through language, through my measurements and what have you? Non-representational thought, though, okay, we go back to the idea that if everything is imminent in the process of becoming, and difference, everything is different from everything else, then non-representational thought draws upon a different epistemology that respects the fact that everything is in process, everything is changing, and so therefore we can't ever describe something as it really is, because at that moment that we've described something, it's a bit like taking a photo that immediately is historical. It can only ever be a moment in the process, because now it's moved on, it's something that's different. So our non-representational thinking is an awareness or a sensitivity to the fact that we can never represent a finished reality, because reality is always in the process of moving and changing. Another idea is the notion of territorialization, and how ideas can create fields and create territories and deterritorialize the fields in which you're studying. I haven't got any actually there, because I'm aware that I could keep on going about trying to map out an ontological terrain for what we're thinking in terms of this sort of shift to thinking in a slightly different way. But what I'd like to do is kind of come back to a couple of those ideas and like your sort of feedback on, so what are some of the core implications of this shifting ontological and conceptual field? The first one for me is we're shifting our focus away from a concern of what bodies are, or what constitutes institutions, or things, or people. We're not along with the essence of things, but we need to focus more on the capacities for their action, their feelings, their desires. And so I suppose there's an element of that. So understanding the sort of the broader systems of thought in which things are enabled. There's a shift in our focus there. The second implication is the implication that there are no deeper structures in which we can rely upon. And I'll give you an example, and I've been interested in being in a couple of workshops last week where I thought people were exceptionally structuralist in their thinking. So there was a lot of people talking about our First Nations people, Maori, a lot of notions around colonization, a lot of notions around, white men. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking, well, you're invoking deep structures, possibly metaphors, but they're deep structures which you're trying to explain and justify certain actions. And so the shift to complexity, a new materialist or a new ontological mindset would say, well, if you don't have those deep structures, if there is no broad defining structure of, say, men, then what's the implications of that to our everyday language, to those people trying to make a point or trying to understand lives? So that's what I mean. The complexity problematizes the notion that there are deep social structures that that shape the way we understand the world. The third implication here is that one that our focus shifts towards ideas, not expressions of, like our traditional ways of gathering data tend to be, what's this person's viewpoint or their actions, the words, the actions, the experiences, and the memories. And instead, we should be focusing perhaps more on is things like effects and forces, desires, flows, intensities, and the types of assemblages that come together and how they come together and how they form territories and how they're broken down. And so that should be the focus rather than sort of the essences and the assumptions that we make around these things as being related to deeper, more permanent type structures. And lastly, I suppose I'm interested in, and the implication here is, how do you start to work when the researcher, like that post-human idea that the researcher is not the center of the world? How do we decenter the researcher and decenter their world viewpoint, decenter the human as being the only thing with a sense of agency in a particular assemblage or a system? And I suppose that brings an awareness to how we construct a system of thought and how that system produces particular types of data, or as I've said here, how it imposes order upon data and therefore creates a way of understanding the world around us. I think it problematizes those sorts of things. So I'll come back to the slide that I started with, which is we're the product of the era in which we're born. And as I said at the start, I can be really attracted to a number of these ideas, but it does feel like I'm sitting on the bank because I'm grounded in and I suppose socialized within and restricted by the language, the traditions of this particular era. And what is emerging is a different way of thinking. And it's very hard to move across that boundary into thinking differently, just because the language we have, because of the ways of thinking that we have at our disposal, do not allow us to engage in the way that those implications and the new ontologies that I've outlined are suggesting that we need to do. So, to go back to the question about are we dealing with complexity theory or theories of complexity, in a sense, I suppose I have leaned more towards trying to argue that the field of complexity supersedes that question because complexity theory can be generated as a way of answering and addressing particular questions. It does particular ideological work, and it does particular theoretical work for particular fields. So it exists, but exists within perhaps a broader framework, a broader system of thinking that other theories can also exist. So we have people in the social sciences, posthumanists, new materialists, who are also generating concepts and ideas which would be useful for us to grapple with in trying to understand this sort of crazy thing called sport, health, physical education, human movement, and what have you. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that's generated and provoked a little bit of a discussion.
Well, Alan, thank you very much for your presentation. It was awesome. And we've been talking about complexity theory versus complexity thinking versus theories of complexity for quite some time. So it was great. So does anybody want to start us off?
Yeah, no, it was really good. It was really good. It's every time I listen to it, I think it sums up all the thoughts that I've been having for quite a while now and grappling with. There's going to be a question. No question yet. But give me some time to think about a question. But it was really, it sums it all up what we're trying to do.
I've got a question.
Excellent.
Well, I've got two questions. So earlier on in the presentation, thank you, Alan, you'd mentioned that you said we can never represent a finished reality. And does that, this is a big question, does that mean the way we approach pre-service teacher physical education, for example, ought not to have endpoints because they're constantly emerging? And therefore, does that make policy enactments, it has to be targeted in some respect to get funding and so forth, but does there also be a vacuum and a space for opportunity to emerge as a result of the other networks and interconnections?
In a sense, I think, yeah, absolutely right. I think you answered your own question here, Alison, in a sense. I remember once arguing or discussing with Richard Tinning. I don't know if you remember Richard's paper about sort of a more modest pedagogy. I don't know if you've read that, but the sort of this, what Richard was saying is that, you know, he reads some of the documents around physical education and he would say, look, you're making these exorbitant claims for what physical education does. And it really doesn't do that. And you need to come back to something that's more sensible. And my concern was as somebody who's been involved in the writing curriculum, when you're in the Ministry of Education, you cannot sit there and suggest modest pedagogy because it's a political battle. You're battling over a space. So when you got scientists who are saying, look, we do absolutely everything and our students need this because, you know, every aspect of their lives are infused with science. And you know, the social scientists or the social geographers and what have you say, oh, you absolutely need this. Every subject's absolutely critical. You can't sit there and say, well, you know, we have a fairly modest, sometimes our kids get something out of it, sometimes they don't. So you actually have to see those policy documents as, in that setting, as political, and they bring a sense of weight and trying to win a curriculum space in which we can work. And so in that sense, I think it's worth seeing those in teacher education. Very much the graduate outcomes and those things are political documents, both which have that are used to validate teacher education and defend it from, in a sense, from people who might want to claim that it's a little bit we can do it in a different way. And they can say, oh no, these are definitely the outcomes, and we're measuring them, what have you. So they're doing political work in that sense, but they're also doing some work and trying to influence the type of outcomes that the broader teacher education machine is trying to produce. But at that level, I would just sort of say, I'd understand that's what they're trying to do. I would never see it from a realist point of view of saying, you really think I'm doing those things or achieving those things? And I'd look at, in teacher ed, when I've looked at my students, they're on individual journeys. It's a bit like, going a walk through the bush. They're all on an individual journey. They might be on the same path, but what they're going to get out of it is very, very different. Hopefully we can all end up at a very similar spot, but it's only ever a movement, and a movement not towards a more finished product, but it's just up movement. So I don't think that my teacher education students are moving from novice to expert. They're just in a process of becoming different from what they were when they started. And in that sense, that means, I'm no more necessarily expert than I was when I did my teacher education 30 years ago. I'm just a different teacher than I was 30 years ago. So there's a whole lot of implications in that about, have they acquired knowledge? Have I transferred anything to them? Or that is just, the interaction that they have in our teacher education is making them different, and we're shaping them. They will embody the history of those interactions, but they'll move ahead. As I say, there's a few ideas in there, but with nothing sort of in that representationalist sort of world of certainty that if we outline these graduate standards, then these students are going to hit them.
Hey, thank you.
Hey, Tim.
I decided to go. I got a dishwasher guy coming to fix my dishwasher. One of those. But it was really cool. I actually really enjoyed that presentation. It brought a lot. I mean, we've had conversations in the past, but you pulled a lot of things together. And I don't know the answer to this question, so I'm asking a question that we talked about earlier on. At the end there, when you were talking more about that, we have theories now that can speak to complexity, because we understand complexity in the way you've described those four attributes. So are we talking about an inter-theory, a meta-theory, or we just don't want to talk about theory when we talk about complexity? What is it that we're grappling with to talk with other people who don't necessarily study complexity?
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I hope you might have some ideas on that. I don't know. One of the workshops I was at this week on new materialism, and I sit there and I think, well, you guys are talking complexity. Some slightly different words, but in essence, if there is an essence, I think that they're using that's and this is an argument, or not an argument, but a discussion that I think we've had before. Is there an underlying set of ideas which tend to imply a paradigm? I tend to think it's probably more a broader system of thought, a worldview or something like that. But if anyone else has got some wisdom on this, it would certainly help me immensely.
Can I just say something? Because thanks for that question, Tim. Because I was exactly thinking that, because the way you summed it all up, it seemed that we were subsuming things like post-structuralism, post-humanism, new materialism under complexity. And I was about to ask you, just before Tim asked, are they also thinking the same way? Are they subsuming us when they think about a post-humanist theorist? Are they thinking of complexity and subsuming it into their theories? So I was going to ask, but Tim has asked it perfectly.
Yeah.
I have no answer for that, but that was what I was thinking too.
I don't know if they're subsumed into each. And in my broader sense of complexity, I think they're subsumed into my worldview. But I'm also interested that if you would be with some new materialist or something like that, that they would say, oh, no, it's not complexivist. But then, as I said, I can also sit there and hear them talking about, these homogenized structures like Maori or men.
You just made me think of another point, that, Adam. When you showed that picture, they're all men.
I absolutely am.
What does that do to speak to the notion of how complexity science has emerged? And maybe we haven't got a female dominant, not female dominant form. I'm trying not to stereotype gender, but a perspective that's been socialized as a female that contributing to the theories of complexity.
I think I noticed that too when I put it together. I thought, oh, I'm better try and find a female. But yeah, you're right. But in one sense, as I said, they're a product of their era, product of the fact that, yes, they are the eras that they were in. Men were privileged and had positions and contributed to the development of these ideas. So, in a sense, they are these people themselves are the product of the social and cultural systems that they're part of. I don't necessarily think they're male ideas, although they've obviously been shaped by those systems of thought. And I suppose it's no surprise if we go through to maybe this, that we're going to see that some of these were developed by women as means to critique the scientized, masculinized view of the world. But once again, I think it's a product of an era, and we have to be really careful about using those deeper structures of male, female, as I think they do political work and they're not necessarily realist. They're not situated in sort of realist sort of beliefs, but
it made me wonder when you were talking that, like, feminism seems to speak more to relationality and the things that you were showing.
Yeah.
It hasn't been generated as a mechanism of understanding complexity. I'm just sort of trying to understand that, because it just seems that feminism lends itself more likely to what you were showing there.
Oh no, I agree, and I suppose it's each of these ideas. Each of these ideas can be used in political ways to be able to affect change, address issues of discrimination, oppression, and what have you. And as I said, that's the notion of affect, so understanding how particular ideas limit other ideas. But I agree with you. The traditional feminist lines of thought haven't necessarily dealt with it like that, but they have dealt with the idea that there are particular systems of thought that are just ideological rather than, realistic, and they've generated that shift in order to address issues of oppression and discrimination.
May I have a comment?
Absolutely, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a very, very nice presentation. And I must say that a lot of this I haven't heard about, but you can stop there. And number 3, number 4, I can get something out of. And especially this becoming rather than being.
All right.
That's very important in my construction of a kind of new didactic for physical education, because that's the main point. We have to look at on each individual in what they can reach, not as a firm goal. So we have a big problem right now that every child should be measured to standards.
Right.
You have to go away from that. You have to have teachers that can go in and let them be a little bit better each time, instead of having these pressures on the kids or students that putting up goals for them. So
No,
becoming instead of being is very, very nice. So you gave me a lot of things to think about. I was also thinking about Wittgenstein and the guys who express our living through how we use our language. That's one thing. The other thing is if we use Bromfenbrenner on analyzing maybe you are in a macro exon level of the philosophy part of this theory, while I'm more into the micro level to see what can we do exactly in the gym with the children, with the students.
yeah, and that's great. I think, and you picking up those ideas, and you see the connection between them. If this can feed up to teachers and help inform the way they think about teaching, then that would be fantastic. As you said there, something as simple as rethinking the concept of health. What are we trying to do? And there's no ideal form. But in fact, health is different for every individual, and that the notion of becoming is that they're always in process. As a late 50-year-old, I'm still going to try to stay fit. I know if I don't, it's got to be an ongoing process, and it's very much a journey. The difference one was interesting because I used to work with somebody who was desperate to try and get fitter. And went to the gym, pushed weights, and in his mind was, he wanted to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger or a derivative of. And the hardest thing was to say to him, the what you're working with, you're never going to look like that. I'm never going to look like that. Very few people will. So what we have to do is find somebody, if you want to look at somebody who is far more realistic for your body shape, age, and what have you, and who's in a good, healthy position and feeling good about themselves, that might be a better role model than Arnold Schwarzenegger, who you're never going to attain. And that, I think that's a similar sort of thing with perhaps what you're talking about with children, finding the images and notions of health which fit this particular individual rather than some ideal form.
Alan, along that same line, in the States right now, very, very standard-based. And I mean, even like our new national standards, it's the physically literate person. That's all, that's what we're moving towards. And it's understandable that they're moving towards that because we have a predominant thought of accountability for teachers, that the only way we can hold teachers to account for their instructional behaviors is if their students are meeting these pre-designed standards of what our students should be achieving at any given point in time. And from a complexity point of view, that's asinine. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. How can we maintain accountability, but still bring in this idea of instead of being, becoming? How do we go about that?
Right. Okay. Well, in one sense, I think physical literacy is a fantastic example of a meme that has been picked up because it fits the current environment, and it's propagated. Suddenly, it's in lots of official documents and what have you, because it's a good fit for the political environment, and it is because of what its potential to do. as opposed to being anything real within there. But anyway, underneath that, I think what you're talking about there is the tension between immanent and transcendent ethics or pedagogies in a way. So we're preoccupied with transcendent standards. These national standards that transcend the nation and can set something firm guidelines and what have you. And in a sense, it's kind of like McDonald's. Your fast food industry operate in the same way. Transcendent, they set a series of standards. And the wonderful thing about McDonald's, it doesn't matter where you go in the country or in the world, you're going to get the Big Mac will be the same everywhere.
I have to disagree with you on that. If you go to a McDonald's in Ireland, I've been there, it does not taste anything like our Big Mac.
Oh, really?
Put that out there.
Okay. But from a point of view of if you would, you've got a series of standards, and you can produce. It's debatable whether it's good food, but you can produce food en masse and regulate it and control it. But no one would necessarily think that that's good dining. And if you had your opportunity, you'd probably take a special person to a restaurant. And so what's different about a restaurant? And a restaurant is probably a chef. The McDonald's guy is not going to call himself a chef. But in a restaurant, you'll have a chef and who is using the principles of good cooking to create something that's unique for that particular area. And I'm sure wherever you go in the world, you'll have top restaurants and really fantastic dining opportunities. But the problem is the chef needs to be highly trained, and it's slightly more expensive, and it's it's hard to control because what's coming out of it is more imminent to the restaurant as opposed to transcendent, relating to a series of standards. So then from a national point of view, that's your problem. If you want to encourage physical activity and try and get people more, our young people or our teachers to give more importance to physical activity, physical education, the development of physical literacy, then you have to create this sort of standardized, transcendent sort of set of ideas and regulate to make it happen. The opposite, which is to develop highly skilled, well-informed teachers who value all aspects of education, is kind of just too expensive, and we can't control it to the same extent that we can. So that's my view on, in the sense that I suppose by setting a set of standards, it'll work, just like McDonald's works, and it provides a level of effect that you can measure and what have you. Is it perfect? No, because what we'd much rather have is highly committed, valued, well-informed teachers who understand deeply what they're doing and are doing it not because they have to, but because they value it and could possibly create a learning experience, a movement experience for kids that is unique and special and oriented around those kids' needs, not, off a textbook. So there you go. There's my little rant.
Yes, we have a dispute here in Norway now. It says that it's very dangerous to have teachers that are very loyal and are very well informed, while
Right.
we really need to have teachers that have knowledge and are critical.
Yeah.
Now, this is why it's so important for me to bring forward such thoughts that each individual are actually an individual and not a part of 120,000 kids.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, John. Yep. It's there has to be, I suppose, you're putting in place some parameters. It's important on a national scale. There's one other force in action here which we often don't talk about, which is that broader question for at a government level of how do you create and deliver a quality education that's just cost effective, and it's becoming more and more expensive. So that's sort of like the problem that governments are dealing with. And in New Zealand, the answer to that has been to open up the field to be more competitive. And so, can we create a system where, teachers can trade and buy, and we can bring in experts and buy resources, and it's not a closed system, but it's a very open system. And so in some ways that we've got people here saying that education is the last marketplace to be developed. If we could only down skill and dumb down teachers a bit so that they need to buy services and training and allow schools to bring people in. There's another force against, what we're kind of thinking about. Well, we want highly trained teachers who can do everything, but you do have a series of people saying, well, why don't you just have an expert in movement education and hire them in for 3 or 4 weeks, and then hire the next person in if it's about developing fundamental movement skills or something. So that's the debate here. But interestingly, I think we're about to move away from that because we now have a left-leaning government instead of a right-leaning government. Something we're shifting away from that.
Can I have a comment on that as well?
Absolutely, yes, please.
The same situation is about to happen, but in kindergarten, because they have the lowest educational level, the people are working there. So they are, instead of developing literature or things themselves, they tend to want to buy pre-produced teaching stuff.
Right.
For instance, from big companies like Pearson. And we really have a problem with people that has not that much knowledge, because they tend to want to buy them out of the problems, so to say.
Right.
Because here it's a lot of money.
Well, I think it's almost global, but it's really interesting to hear that at that level. I know some of the research we've done here in Auckland, there are something like 154 different companies in Auckland that sell their services in health and physical education to schools. And that is everything from planning services to in-service training to all the different curriculum areas you can hire in your body, all the health areas. You've got groups that have a big truck that drives around and parks in your school. And when you look at it, that's just stunning, the amount of people trying to get into the schools. And the only quality control is that teacher or the school who's going to say, well, we don't want those people in. And no, thank you, we're not going to buy that service in. But as my daughter, who's a phys ed teacher, found out this year, New Zealand softball had a group that came in. The head of the department had brought them in. She didn't necessarily want them to come and teach her class, but they did 2 lessons, and then she realised they didn't have an understanding of the curriculum and what good pedagogy. And then she was the only one in the phys ed department that said to the head of the HOD, well, I'm not having them back in there. It's rubbish. So it's amazing the effects, but I haven't heard it down at early childhood. And I like that concept that you said, Jan, of buying their way out of a problem. That's quite an interesting concept.
Can I say?
Go ahead. Would I liken that to the English curriculum and the English situation?
Yes.
So could you go back to your screen on the implications that you had, Alan? It was just one more. Yeah, I'm looking at the second and third one. My question came when you were talking for your abstract. You mentioned the elephant in the room about the variety of theories and how they might be merging. In order, is there an oxymoron saying there's a cause for a case or an ecological complex pedagogical framework for physical education, and rather than fight about who's providing, because the providers, it's a shark fest in England, and you're around the table and it's just people who want the money, and the money's been so misappropriated that we're rewriting the APPG document to say how should sport and premium be done for the next couple of years, knowing full well that it's going to run out in any case.
Right.
Are your implications moving toward the encouragement of a complexity-based pedagogical framework, so that only those who were able to merge through those understanding networks could be privy or able to teach physical education? Or is that then already sort of putting it in a way that it doesn't equate with complexity because it's trying to define a framework?
I think sort of thinking back something that Brent Davis said once, or might have published it, which was one of the things about complexity is that it takes the humanist concepts out of it. So, he would say, look, he doesn't take a position. It's just looking at that, what's forming, as one, you could call phys ed and what we've been doing an attractor, and this is the state it's been in, and now as the environment changes, it morphs into a new state. It'll get to a new attractor that satisfies all the constraints that it's working in. And for some, they would say, look, you don't have to go any further. To put a moral position on that means that it's a bit dodgy in terms of the complexity stuff. However, I think you can, with a foot in both camps, probably say, I like to think of the fact that advocacy is really important. Advocacy means, if you look at it, everything has an effect. So if you don't say something, you don't know whether your advocacy will materialize in some sort of large whole-scale system change, but sometimes it does, but it will have an effect. And so I think it is important that you're constantly advocating for, bringing in bringing that information into the system so that it is part of the process that is. And I think that's important. From a different aspect, I think point 2 there that undermines any conception of turning social structure. I think there is a sense there that we need to, in the modern world, be a lot more attentive to helping students put together the types of connections that they need in order to be successful. So how do they access the resources? So we're not necessarily anymore telling them information, but instead helping them put together the type of systems or connections that they need to be successful. And in a sense, what I mean there is, when my daughter came through university, I used to say to her, because she was really scared, she said, I'm not bright enough to be in university. And I'd say, look, it has nothing to do with brightness. There are some people who know how to get through university. So it's more about, putting together the help that you need to get through, being smart enough to know that, than actually being smart yourself. It's who you know almost rather than what you know. And so in terms of being, say just something like being physically active in the future, I think it's about helping kids know how do they access the type of resources that are there, and how to make sense of the information that their technologies are going to be providing them, as opposed to, you know, something else. So there's two at once. Again, there's two ideas there, Alison. The notion of advocating, but also being aware that things will shift, and because of the environment that we're in.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. In order to operationalize that as an advocate with colleagues, what would you recommend as a takeaway message?
It's a really interesting question. Because a project that I've been trying to get up and rolling with a group, trying to get them to think about what does it mean. This is a university. Trying to get them to reflect on what does it mean to be an academic in a neoliberal university. And someone like myself who's been around for a while, the game has changed. So the notion of working together is with colleagues, working together collaboratively. I suddenly realized we don't share all the same values. So in this other university that I was looking at, there's a real tension between the, say, the new age academic who understands exactly what's required in terms of publications and research grants and what have you, in order to get tenure in the way they're measured, as opposed to the older ones who have got tenure and have come from a different system, and you're trying to say, look, this is really valuable. And so I don't know what the answers are at the moment. We're just at the beginning of the process to say, look, let's study how this new academic is being produced by the forces and the sort of the ideologies of a new university, because the new university, I think English universities have been in this for much, much longer, dealing with funding and expectations around research and teaching. So the environment keeps changing for them. So how they produce the concept of academic is changing. So our experience of it would be that the rules of the game keep changing all the time. And some people are advantaged by that. Some people are disadvantaged by it. I don't know if that answers your question, Alison, but I think it's worth always putting on the table, trying to keep some of these, things, like if you're working with colleagues, and it goes back to, Sparks's stuff about, micropolitics of workplaces. Some people are advantaged and some people are disadvantaged by any change that goes on. And so being aware of that. So when change happens in a department, how can we ensure that it's like, win-win situation for everybody and not just somebody who's getting the benefit out of it?